Hello and welcome to Koenig Heritage Let's Talk About. And in today's topic, we're going to explore industrial safety as a defensive sector. Now, you might be wondering why we're looking at industrial safety. To those of you who don't know, Koenig Heritage is a holding company based in Sydney, Australia, and we focus primarily on non-discretionary services and product because they are more resilient in the long term. Now, what does it mean to be defensive? In our opinion, to be defensive means to own companies. Koenig Heritage only owns private companies that are able to generate income, whether that's dividend or growth, throughout different economic cycles. Naturally, that leads us to sectors like industrial safety and others too. But today I decided to do a particular session on industrial safety and explore whether that fits into the category of a defensive sector. Now, very fortunate to have two of our members today here as part of the discussion, Mr. David Stillman and Mr. Adrian Moffatt. Adrian and David, thank you very, very much for agreeing to jump on this recording and share your views with the audience.
Thanks, Nita. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Thank you very much. Now, before we start, I think you two have eras of experience when it comes to industrial safety. And for the purpose of the audience who are less familiar with you, I would love you to share some of your background. How do you even get to that industry and the particulars of your career? David, perhaps we start with you.
Yes, thank you. David Stillman speaking. My career was mainly with two large multinationals. The first one was SO Australia Limited, which then was part of the Exxon Group and is now part of Exxon Mobil. And I had almost 13 years with that company. The rest of my career was mainly with Kimberly-Clark Corporation, which is a fast-moving consumer goods business. The things that those two businesses had in common were firstly, they were vertically integrated manufacturing businesses, quite complex in terms of the supply chain, but both of them had a very high emphasis on safety procedures and outcomes. I guess my extra experience in the industrial safety area came as a result of Kimberly-Clark, the business I was involved with at Kimberly-Clark, manufacturing and selling safety products. The business I ran was the Asia Pacific business, which was called Kimberly-Clark Professional. And Kimberly-Clark Professional is Kimberly-Clark's B2B or business-to-business arm, and as distinct from the B2C arm, which typically operates through retail outlets. So we sold to a whole range of different businesses right across Asia Pacific, and safety was one of our categories. So I've had the opportunity to visit many different industrial sites, talk about their procedures and processes. And so industrial safety is something that I've been involved with both on the job and from a supplier perspective for many years. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. And perhaps for a little bit of a different perspective, Adrian, I'd love you to share your background with the audience because I think that is absolutely critical for today's discussion.
Sure. So by background, I'm a corporate lawyer, but for the last sort of 12 plus years, I've been a legal and corporate executive in several companies across the mining services, manufacturing and construction industries. Each of the entities that I've worked for have had very strong safety cultures, and they both, they all operate in very regulated health and safety environments, in particular mining and construction. So I've had a lot of exposure to that industrial health and safety part there through my role in those companies. My current role is General Manager, Legal and Corporate, as well as Group Legal Counsel for Asia Pacific at Ozco Modular. And Ozco Modular is Australia's leading modular building construction and hire firm. So we have exposure to the construction market, the infrastructure market, mining and resources sector, as well as within the company, we manufacture across Australia and New Zealand within the Asia Pacific part of the business. So I've got exposure to that health and safety environment within each of those industries, and also internally within the business around that construction and manufacturing side. Another thing that I've recently been doing is advising a startup company that is looking to commercialize some engineered controls in the silicosis space. So they've developed some innovative engineered controls, and what they're trying to do is help stonemasons and construction companies to mitigate and minimize silica exposure to their workers. So I've been working with them as well. So I've got, a very broad background and exposure in across the industrial safety space.
Thank you very much, Adrian and David, too. Now, to those of you who are new to this type of discussions, we always start from the broader picture and then go to the details. And I think the question I'd like to pose to both of you, and it's a very general question. We all hear about industrial safety, safety of workers, et cetera, et cetera. But what does it actually mean? What is industrial safety?
Yeah, look, so I can start there, Nitay. So industrial safety is, I guess, looking at, and there's a number of elements to it, and I'm sure we'll unpack those, but looking at the health and safety environment within the industrial sector. So as we talked about there in the construction, the mining, and all that sort of space. But I think once you start to unpack that, there's a number of elements to that. And I guess you could start with the first element is probably around the design services part of industrial safety. So that's particularly looking at designing, using qualified engineers and people like that to design solutions to minimize risk and harm to workers. So coming up with engineered controls that allow people within that space to do stuff safely. So it's coming up with those things. Now, some of those engineered controls can come from working on the job, working out solutions on the job to do it. But there is also companies within the industry who specialize in solving problems, safety problems for people by designing and engineering solutions that make work safer there as well. And it doesn't always have to be an engineered solution. Like it could also be, if you're looking at on-the-job situations, just different ways of working that are safer. So for an example, within our business, we do a lot of working at heights, and we have a lot of, within our factories, we have a lot of harness systems and things like that so that people can safely work on the roof of our buildings and things like that. And they're engineered controls, but there's other ways you can look at things. So for example, in the modular building space, we often, what we call complex the two buildings together. So a modular building is, can be in different shapes, but, like 6 meters by 3 meter sort of rectangular building, but you can make them into two buildings to make a bigger space, obviously. And we need to seal the join in the roof line. Now that would typically involve climbing up onto the roof and having controls in place to protect from working at heights there, obviously. But we've developed solutions over the years whereby we can do a lot of that work from the ground. We've invented a system which we call SealSafe, which is kind of like a sail you would see on a sail ship. So you feed it into a runner and the person at the other side pulls it along rather than necessarily having to be on the top. And I've been involved in that project around patenting some of that stuff. So there's ways of designing on the job, or as I say, there's companies out there that do that.
So thank you, Adrian. I think design is where we start with industrial safety. Obviously, most of especially new build, you need to design the system to be able to do that. David, do you have any other comments on what else you consider part of industrial safety?
Yes, I guess having designed something that's useful to a customer, then it needs to be sold and delivered. And So there's a whole industry out there that supplies not only safety products like personal protection, but also systems, hardware, technology that really allow businesses to operate their safety systems and processes successfully. So that's a very broad range of industries, because the technology that's involved, for example, fire protection, is a lot different to say dust protection. Personal PPE personal protection can range from, headwear right through to footwear. So there's quite a large range of suppliers out there. The aggregation of those products tends to occur more as you get closer to the customer. The businesses that produce those products tend to specialise a little, and once you get closer to the customer, distributors aggregate those various services in some cases, particularly PPE, for example. So there is a very broad range of suppliers servicing companies that are focused on safety.
Thank you, David. And I assume when we talk about PPE, protective gear, it ranges from garments to headwears to masks even today. I mean, especially with COVID-19, we see, I guess it's not B2B, but we see a lot more awareness of protective gear that otherwise we wouldn't have seen. Do you think that's a correct assumption?
Well, certainly the pandemic has raised awareness of PPE. I think maybe 12 months ago, a lot of people would have struggled to understand what PPE is. Now, at least the term's familiar, but PPE is a very familiar term for most industries. PPE is not necessarily, I mean, PPE tends to be the end point. If all else fails, then you've got to provide PPE. But ideally, you want to engineer out the source or the cause, unless it's not cost effective to do so. But, PPE should not be the going in position. It should be the result of having tried a whole range of other things.
Yeah. And Adrian, I assume you guys use a lot of PPE throughout your daily work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we use all sorts of stuff to protect in the factory and out on site while we're doing construction. And as you say, with COVID now, even in the office environment, we're bringing in PPE or ways of, mitigating, the effect of the virus to office staff. And there's a whole lot of stuff that comes out of that. Also around the areas of technology, I've seen, even with COVID, some of the reporting, the checking in stuff for people to keep those records and things like that, we haven't seen before. But I think in the safety space, there's a real opportunity in the technology and the safe software space. Now, there's a lot of people out there already starting to develop products and programs and things like that. A lot of it's based around the record keeping, that side of the safety element. But I see into the future, and probably not too far into the future, the use of a lot of Internet of Things, sensors. I could see a time where, for example, a construction site could have sensors positioned all across the site, and someone be able to manage, emissions, dust, noise, that sort of stuff from a dashboard, and use technology in that sort of space. So I think there's a real opportunity in the technology side and the software side of safety that is ahead of us. And there's some really well-known and successful companies already playing in that space as well.
Thank you, Adrian. And I echo your thoughts here. I mean, for me, when I look at industrial safety, if you're a business, you don't have a choice. You have to protect your employee. This is not and maybe we'll touch on it in more details later. You have to do it. You have to take care of your employees, whether that's, and we talked about industrial safety, what it includes, like design services, the different PPE components. You just now mentioned the software, but I think there's another, and David, I'm keen to hear your thoughts here. There's another very important element. And the fact that you have all of it, I don't think that's enough. you need to make sure that you actually maintain it and comply with it.
Yeah, so we've talked about design and also the provision of safety equipment and services, but once those elements are in place, it's really important that they be maintained, but also that compliance is ensured as well. So there are a whole lot of companies out there that assist with accreditation, with testing, maintenance, certification, whatever you want to call it. And all of those things are very important because, some of the aspects of safety management are quite technical. And from time to time, you really need experts to come in and make sure that it's working properly. Of course, some of it is also regulated. Fire systems, for example, there are requirements in terms of how often those things need to be checked by independent experts. So there is a large number of service providers out there who are providing those sorts of services.
Thank you. And I think the next thing is to see whether the assumption is correct. In your opinion, is the industrial safety market stable and defensive? Or is it just perhaps a fallacy that people think and industrial safety is not a defensive sector per se, generally speaking, of course? So I'd love to hear your comments on this. David, perhaps we start with you.
Yeah, I believe it is defensive for a few reasons. One, first of all, there are certainly companies out there that believe safety is good business. And I was fortunate enough to work for two companies that definitely thought that way, and they walk the talk. And walking the talk's really important in safety. So it is important from a bottom line perspective, and the investment in safety is, a real business investment. But it is also very important in terms of employee engagement, culture, and morale. So those things go hand in hand. And I think the awareness amongst companies is growing that safety is a good thing to do and is a good thing for your business. I guess the second aspect of it is that it's a highly regulated area. There is very strong legislation, at least in Australia, in all states, and it is a state-based responsibility, but there's a high degree of consistency of legislation between the states. And importantly, the legislation has real teeth. There are penalties for not only companies, but for individuals who have responsibility for operations. So, there is that, we've got to do this because if we don't do it, we're in trouble. But there's also, as I said before, a growing awareness that it's a good thing to do from a business perspective.
Adrian, would you echo that, or do you have a different views on whether that is defensive sector?
Yeah, no, I totally echo what David was saying there. Look, to be honest, with the legislation that is in place at the moment, companies have to comply to exist. It's not discretionary. So the sector is a non-discretionary sector because there is that underlying statutory and legislative environment that requires them to have these safety procedures in place. And as David said, they're very stringent, and the penalties extend beyond just the company. They extend to the directors and officers of those organisations as well. So it is I definitely agree that it's a stable and defensive sector. It's a mature industry as well. But there's probably, I guess you could pull it apart and say that there's probably parts that aren't as defensive and stable. So obviously the requirements for PPE and related products and services probably go with economic conditions as well. So particularly you look at the construction industry, obviously when construction is on and there's a lot of activity in the construction space, there'll be a lot of demand for products and services in that PPE space. But probably when that, if there's a decline in some of those construction markets, there'll obviously be less of a demand for some of that PPE. So overall, it's a defense, in my view, it's a defensive stable industry. But you've probably got these bits on the edges that do have some reliance on economic activity as well.
I think that's a fantastic point, Adrian, because we as an investor, we must never speak in absolute, because there's no absolute, right? And nothing is completely defensive or completely non-discretionary. And I think your point on the new build, definitely, in my opinion, if there's an economic downturn in the next period of time, I believe we already are in, then obviously PPE, and we talk about the 4 pillar of design, PPE supply, et cetera, we are likely to see somewhat of a decline in, say, apartment buildings, those who provide industrial safety elements to that. But on the other hand, if you are mining or smelter or whatever it is that you do, and you just keep chugging along, personally, I believe you'll see consistent demand for PPE and industrial safety requirements. David, do you agree with that?
Yeah, look, I think fundamentally the safety systems and processes are still there. But there are some aspects of safety, like PPE, for example, that tend to be employee related. So if there's a downturn in employment, you could get a bit of a downturn in PPE. But all of the other aspects of safety management are still in place. They need to be in place. Just because you've got a downturn doesn't mean you can turn your back on safety. And my experience has been that, you know, during a downturn, you start looking at all sorts of cost cutting, and, you know, things like training seem to go by the wayside, and there's a debate about whether that's good or bad. And, you know, you start cutting marketing budgets and those sorts of things. But certainly in my experience, you know, cost cutting on safety was not something that was discussed at any point in time. So, you know, it tends to hold up pretty well during a downturn.
Yeah. Adrian, do you have any other comments on this, or?
No, I think that pretty much sums it up. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
I think for me, even say in new construction, right? Yes, perhaps apartment buildings are less likely to be successful as an industry as they were a year ago. Again, I'm not in real estate, so this is just a statement. This is not a prediction. But there will still be a new build, and they will still need the helmets, and will still need the gloves on whatever it is that they're doing. It just, from a safety perspective, it means that whoever is supplying is just supplying less. It's not that the industry goes to zero, right? So that's point number one. Point number two is, as an investor, for example, us, we need to focus on things, or at least the majority. And the second point is that when we look at it as an investment proposal, or if you as an audience look at it, you need to build what I call a base load of stable income, i.e. not new build related. And then a new build or new projects should be your cherry on top of the cake, because in the good time, probably the margins there are higher. Okay, thank you very much. That was very informative. I think if you look at it, what we covered so far, we covered what is industrial safety. Then we looked at why is it considered, generally speaking, defensive sector. The other things I want to explore with you, and this is the gist of the conversation today, is how is industrial safety going to shape in the future? I mean, in the 50s, industrial safety perhaps was a recommendation as opposed to a requirement. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, and to the 2000s, we've seen some tightened regulations around it and more awareness of it. Definitely in 2020, there's hyper awareness of safety in general. But I'm keen to see and hear what your views are on how this is going to shape in the next decade or in the next future.
I'll start. So I think what we're going to see over the next few years is a real tailwind behind legislation. I think legislation is going to drive the industry. I think we're only starting to see governments put in place tougher and tougher legislation for companies to comply with around health and safety. And look, let's see what happens out of the pandemic and whether that puts an extra focus on some of that safety, particularly on the health side. I think we always talk about health and safety, but it seems like the safety part of it tends to get most of the focus and probably most of the dollar spend on it by companies. And I think there's probably a number of reasons for that. I think the health side has a longer period before it becomes noticed. So for example, on the safety side, if someone cuts their hand in a factory while working with steel or metal or something like that, there's an instant reaction and you've got an instant injury. So it kind of gets that front of mind. Whereas if you look at some of the health related risks within some of these industries, and we're talking of things like fumes, emissions, dust, noise, asbestos, silica, things like that. The period from when people get affected is a lot longer. So it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. But I think, we had asbestos in the past and it's still there, but we have asbestos. Silica is a big thing that's coming through. There's a lot of legislation now being put onto stonemasons and related companies like that around looking at that stuff. And that stuff had traditionally had a longer period before you started noticing the illnesses and things and the effects of that thing. But as I said, I think traditionally we've had a stronger focus on the safety side than the health side. But I think over the next, over the short to medium period, I think we're going to see a real shift where health becomes a lot more prevalent. I'd be looking at it roughly, but let's say that 95% of spend today is on safety, whereas probably 5% is on the health side. I wouldn't be surprised if that gets up around 50-50, definitely by the end of the decade, as health becomes a bigger issue. And, maybe the COVID pandemic will bring that out. That's a health issue. So maybe it brings health to the forefront.
Yeah. And I remember in the swine flu, they put these heat sensors in the airports. Yeah, who knows where COVID-19 is going to lead us. David?
I guess in my last job with Kimberly-Clark, because I had responsibility for Asia Pacific, I was able to observe a lot of different markets in different stages of development, particularly from a safety perspective. I spent a lot of time in India, for example, and China. And the contrast there is enormous. I visited a Mercedes-Benz plant in India, which is as good as any manufacturing plant I've ever seen in the world. But I also visited some other manufacturing facilities in India that, very hard to describe. You wouldn't want your family working there. On the other hand, Australia is a much more mature market, but I think from a corporate responsibility point of view, the goalposts are really changing, and they have been changing for the last 20 years or so. And so companies are realizing that they've got a responsibility to their shareholders in terms of profit and dividends, but their broader responsibility is also being demanded in terms of their social responsibility, their economic responsibility, their environmental responsibility, and all of these impact broadly on health and safety programs. And it's increasingly unclear where safety ends and health starts. They're all part of the same discussion. So I do think this is going to continue, that the public and shareholders and politicians and regulators are going to demand greater responsibility from companies in all of those areas. And for that reason, industrial safety is going to continue to grow as part of that push.
I agree with you, David. And if I combine two statements that Adrian said and you, it's a good business practice, but also, as Adrian mentioned before, the legislation has, I'm using slang here, real teeth. They're going to bite you if you don't comply.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that Adrian mentioned in nicer words earlier. Yeah. Adrian, I know you do a lot of tenders, and when we spoke offline, you did mention that it's become more of a regulated environment too, and requirements of industrial safety. I'd love you to touch on it in 30 seconds or so, whether you see, for example, government contracts or even big companies' contracts requiring industrial safety as part of tenders process.
Yeah, Nitay. Every tender that we do has a big section related to health and safety and our reporting of that, our compliance to that. And I think, that's not just the government contracts or the tier ones, tier twos. We're seeing that in most of the tenders that we do. But I think what we'll find over the coming sort of couple of years, especially with off the back of the COVID pandemic, and as government starts to spend more money on infrastructure and government projects, I think you're going to find a lot of auditing of some of those health and safety compliance obligations, particularly because they're going to be spending big amounts of money. And I'm sure the opposition, whether it's at state level or at federal level, will be holding them to account for the spend of that money and making sure that that money is spent with organisations that have the right compliance, that meet the legislative requirement, and then it will extend to things like local buy and things like that. So there'll be, I believe, over the next couple of years, off the back of some of this stimulus spending that the governments will do, that there will be a lot of auditing of that. So companies won't be able to just tick boxes on the tender. I think they're really going to have to prove that they've got these procedures and processes in place. I've got the right tools and things like that in place, because I think that the regulators will start auditing some of these things.
David, do you agree with that?
Yes, that's certainly been my experience, that's been a major push in the last 10 years or so. It has made tendering more complex, but it's what's happening, and it's what we have to do as part of business these days.
David, what's your views, talking about compliance, if you need to now to be more stringent on ensuring that you comply with safety, otherwise your tendering is going to be less successful. In terms of technology, do you see a push in terms of technology, software in the future?
I think technology is helping us in monitoring, certainly. It depends on the processes that you have, but certainly technology that allows us to monitor operations is improving, enormously. And that's just not in the safety area, it's, process monitoring and all sorts of things. So I think, where technology can help with that compliance, it's going to be very important. That technology needs to be included in safety procedures, operating procedures. People need to be trained. But at the end of the day, there's an increased demand from workers and employers that they want to go home in at least as healthy state as they came to work. And society is becoming more litigious. And so if you don't uphold those standards, then not only will, regulation come down on you, but also you run the risk of class actions and those sorts of things. So there's a lot more pressure on companies now than there used to be. But at a very base level too, it's very important in terms of people's choice of employers. Younger people now are becoming much more portable in terms of their employment. I only really worked for a couple of companies. Now those days have gone. So moving between companies is very important. People have choice about which companies they want to work for. They do a lot more research about what those companies are like, what sort of culture they have, what sort of retention they have. In some cases, people ask about the safety records of companies because they want to be assured that they're going to be working for a good employer. So the demands are coming from a lot of different areas, and it's going to be increasingly important for companies to comply, firstly because they want to, but also because they have to.
Thank you, David. Adrian, any other comments on where you think this might be heading?
Look, the only other point that maybe we should touch on, and David touched on a little bit earlier, is that the industrial safety market is quite fragmented. There's particular leaders within sectors of that market, but overall the whole market is quite fragmented, and there's probably a real opportunity there for some consolidation of the market, and to come up with, you know, companies that have a portfolio of products or service offering that they can offer to those same customers, but not necessarily within that one sort of stream or product line. So there's probably an opportunity there in the future as well for some consolidation within the market.
Thank you, Adrian. David, any other points you'd like to mention before we move on?
Yeah, I agree with Adrian. Certainly there's an enormous opportunity for consolidation in a lot of the different areas of the safety industry. It does tend to consolidate a bit the closer you get to the customer, particularly in distribution, but at the point of manufacture, the point of the introduction of the technology, it still tends to be quite specialized and quite fragmented.
Yeah, thank you for that. This has been absolutely fantastic. Before we conclude, and I hope to those of you who watched that you got some understanding of why industrial safety, at least we consider it, as a defensive sector, and why it is likely to be more stable throughout an economic downturn or upturn, and why it's an area that we put particular focus into in the long term. And I have a phrase, and to those of you who heard this before, industrial safety can come across as boring, as non-exciting, but I always say, as an investor particularly, when something is boring, I am more excited. So this is particularly when it comes to industrial safety, because it is more stable. Before we conclude, and we thank you for your time, Adrian and David, do you have any closing remarks?
I guess I'd like to finish with the message, and I do firmly believe this because I've lived it, is that, you know, a safe business is a good business, and there are a lot of benefits to a business through having strong safety programs in place.
Thank you, David. And I agree with you. I mean, who wouldn't want to work in a safe business? It's as simple as that. Adrian, any last comments?
Yeah, look, I agree with David there on that point, that it's good for business. But I guess the other piece is that it's not going away. The legislation, as we discussed today, the legislation is only going to get tougher in my eyes. That's what I believe. So it's a necessity that companies definitely focus on this from both that business side, but also the compliance and the regulatory side as well. So I think it's definitely a market that's got opportunity out there, and definitely something there's definite growth potential in this sector over the medium term.
Yeah, I can't see industrial safety I can't see the government say, we're relaxing industrial health and safety regulations.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much for your time. I hope to those who watch at home, this was extremely beneficial to me, and I hope to you as well. Adrian, thank you for your time. David, thank you for your time. And with that, we will conclude. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.